And now, our feature contemplation.
Speaking Cinema with Andrew Schwartz.
Hello all, Andrew here. Thanks again for listening. I'd like to preface this episode by issuing to you a sincere apology. It seems that due to a technical issue, I was unable to use the primary audio track that I usually use for my own recording in this episode. Instead, I had to use the backup audio, which is highly inadequate. So I do apologize sincerely about that, and I do hope you can overlook it for this episode. I'm doing everything I can to prevent this from ever happening again. So, with that said, I give you Lost in Translation. Welcome to the first episode of the second season of the Speaking Cinema podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Schwartz, and we did take a little bit of a break in between seasons. I had to move and do a couple other things that took up a lot of time, so thank you so much for staying with us. And in the first episode of this new season, we have a really extraordinary film and an extraordinarily suitable guest for that film. He was with us for the very first episode of episode 1, and now he's back with us, and I'm so excited because we are taking a trip to Tokyo and visiting Sofia Coppola's Lost in Translation from 2003. Now, guys, this guest, Jon Bewley, has been a student of the Japanese language for, over a decade now, a long time, and he has traveled to Japan. I think we mentioned this in the Okja episode. He's traveled to Japan several times, and he even aspires to visit more or even live there one day. And he's just an expert at this point on the culture, the language, everything you can imagine. And he's been to Tokyo, which is where this film takes place. So he is just the perfect person to talk to. And on top of all of that, he's just extraordinarily knowledgeable about film in general. So I'd like to introduce, yet again, we never get tired of talking to this guy, cinematographer, writer, and director, and producer, Jon Bewley. Jon, thanks for returning to season 2.
Hey, thanks for having me back, buddy, and thanks for really overselling my qualifications on all of that. I am nowhere near as qualified as you claim me to be. But
come on. You're underselling. You're underselling. We're talking about Lost in Translation, and this is an interesting choice, I think, Jon, because the film, while I love this film so much, it has kind of been out of the conversation for a while, right? Because at this point, it's over 20 years old now. 21 years ago, this film came out, and it caused quite a stir. I mean, it's this idea of an indie film, this small film, $4 million budget, right? This very unknown Scarlett Johansson at the time, combined with an extremely known movie star, Bill Murray, and also rather unknown Sofia Coppola, aside from her last name. Except I think she had made The Virgin Suicides.
Yeah, she made The Virgin Suicides, and that was a huge splash.
It was a huge splash.
At Cannes, and then I believe at Cannes. I could be wrong as I get flamed.
It was a huge splash in the indie world, I feel. Yeah. And of course, Cannes. But this film really brought her into the public eye, the mainstream.
Absolutely. And I mean, Scarlett Johansson was also, she co-starred with Thora Birch in Ghost World, which came out, I believe that was 2001, right?
Yes. That was just a couple years earlier. And yeah, we covered that movie with Jessie Mendelson.
Yeah.
In season 1.
That was her first exposure, because otherwise I don't think she would have been given the casting.
Yes. Well, actually, Sofia had said that she was a fan of Scarlett since Scarlett was in, I forget the name of the movie, but she was only 10 years old in this other movie. Scarlett had been acting for quite some time already, which is surprising. She was only 17 in this.
People
I think it was Manny and Lowe.
People forget that she was an established child actor for quite a period of time.
Yes, absolutely. Since like 94, 95. So she was a really young child actress. She'd started very young. And then, yeah, she got Ghost World in about 2000. They shot in 2000, and that came out in 2001. And it was so much fun covering that podcast. But her performance in Ghost World was very different from this one. She was only 15 there, and I guess 17 here. Such a young actor, but you could tell how much she had grown from Ghost World to this, which is extraordinary. And on top of that, she is playing a recent college graduate at 17.
Yeah.
So that's very impressive.
I was really surprised on a rewatch on this rewatch to learn that she was 17 when she did this, because I thought
Yeah.
she was about the character's actual age, about 22.
Me too. Me too. The way she carries herself, the hair and makeup, the way she walks, the way she talks, the in between moments. Yeah, it's a very masterful, technically child performance, right? I mean, it's a late adolescent, but it's still technically a child performance, and damn, is it an impressive one?
Yeah.
And can you imagine having to hold your candle to Bill Murray sitting across from you the whole movie? It's just unbelievable to think about.
And not to
But,
mention that it's holding a candle to Bill Murray in his arguably his best performance of his career.
yeah, his only Oscar nominated performance. So what an experience for such a young actor. And that always factors into the final product here when we talk about this, the meaning in movies on this podcast. I mean, it's just incredible how there are all these moving parts and we're putting them together, and everyone has so many emotions and such a wild experience putting these movies together, contributing all of their kind of individual angles toward making this thing. And hers is a very important contribution. She said it was a very difficult shoot for her, which is understandable. I mean, you're in a completely different country and so on, and you're acting with Bill Murray. Your scene partner is a legend, apparently, and she was very excited to work with him, she said, but she was also scared. And I mean, anyone who's 37, let alone 17, would have been scared to act with this powerhouse man. But we'll get to that. So I'd like to introduce the movie just a little bit with our log line. Okay, the log line for Lost in Translation is: a faded movie star and a neglected young woman form an unlikely bond after crossing paths in Tokyo. Yeah, so it's pretty simple. It's a pretty simple movie, which has been part of its criticism for a long time, too. Oh, the plot's too simple. Not enough happens, right? And that's where we come in, the meaning detectives, because John you can't see him, but John has a look on his face, and it just kind of screams, "Huh, Americans."
That's not even American. It's like,
Yeah.
the movie's simple. It's like, who cares? It's that is a
Yeah.
slight pet peeve to me, because a film can be simple, and a film doesn't always have to be. It doesn't always have to follow a hero's journey structure in the way that like a Star Wars does, or a Jaws, or anything. And I would argue one of the new film that Wim Wenders put out last year, Perfect Days, which starred Koji Yakusho. That in many ways is also a very simple film.
Mm-hmm.
And it's marvelous. You don't have to always be complicated when you make a film. So it's just a little pet peeve of mine.
Yes, of course.
Because there are so many different types of stories, and film is interesting because it is associated so much with being entertainment first and foremost, because of the way that American filmmaking and studio filmmaking across the world in general presents itself. And I understand that. This is a business at the end of the day. Almost anything involving creativity and art has a commercial aspect to it. However, there are different groups and subgenres, and I understand where the criticism might come from, but I do sometimes find that calling a film simple and criticizing it for its simplicity is a somewhat lazy critique, because that really boils down to a matter of taste more than
Right.
an objective quality. And I myself have tried to step away from whether something is a binary good or bad. I mean, we've had this
Right.
conversation about films like Ari Aster's Hereditary
Right.
in the past, where something can be good and you don't have to like it. When people call a film bad for its simplicity, it does get me going a little bit.
Yeah, of course. And I think that's very well said. Especially the part about films being different for different people. I mean, I do think that entertainment is key for a film, but like you said, that connects with taste, right? And yeah, you're right that this binary of a movie's good, a movie's bad. You hear a lot of people, especially industry people and movie junkies, say it was fine. That's also a bit of a scapegoat to me for taking a closer look at the movie. Sometimes movies are just very surface and they just don't require, or it's not very, profitable for you to actually take a closer look at what's going on. But especially in the world of indie films, which I would argue this film comes from, has every sort of badge of an indie movie, minus the movie star. But the character is a movie star in the film, right? So that tracks. But whenever you have something like this, it's very important that people understand that it's some sort of an alternative way to tell a story, right? Instead of just like what you alluded to, this sort of hero's journey, box office, greedy sort of story that just has a lot of fireworks in it. This film is more of an experience. And I know that in itself is vague, but I like to think of it that way. And I think that there are fewer and fewer movies out these days that you can describe as, oh, this movie's about the experience. And there's something so intimate and so alternative about this experience to many other movies in here, which is what I think makes it interesting in the first place. And then it's also just extremely well crafted. And that's what makes it meaningful. And that's why I want to dive in.
Well, and I
Yeah,
would argue just
yeah.
as an additional too, if you were to take this film and put it through the lens of the hero's journey, or Adam's favorite screenwriter Blake Snyder and his method Save the Cat, if you were to look at this film through that lens, you could still find those beats. They are still there. They still exist. It's probably to a lesser extent, but it still does follow a somewhat traditional form of storytelling. It's just a lot more subtle.
Right.
As opposed to your typical studio comedy, which is designed, cynically or not, to draw a profit.
Right. I mean, listen, any movie that does its job well is tough to make. It's really hard.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, whether you have to dedicate yourself to the style, no matter what that style is, if it's minimalistic, if it's realistic, if it's impressionistic, etc., if it's experimental, you have to dedicate yourself unflinchingly to that style, right? And you have to go to the very end, all the way there, and to devote yourself, as Sofia Coppola has done here, to this style, which partly is her own voice, which she's found quite well by this point. But also just what she believes this story that she wrote to be about, the essence of it, right? In order to just construct a sort of character piece within that kind of universe of storytelling so well and so craftily is very impressive and very difficult.
Well, to go off of that too, something about Sofia Coppola's films that also make them stand out for her work specifically, and many filmmakers are like this too. Quentin Tarantino is another one who I would put in this camp. But what makes Sofia Coppola's films stand out in particular for herself against her loglines are her choices for her soundtracks.
Yeah.
Part of what people talk about when they talk about how much they love this film is the soundtrack.
Yes.
You can't talk about Lost in Translation without talking about My Bloody Valentine.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost every Reddit thread I looked at after watching this film again, almost every single one mentioned My Bloody Valentine and the cinema.
Yeah.
And
It's
that's
so
something
true.
that you don't get from just a log line, because that's a personal touch, that's a personal flourish.
Yeah.
Imagine Reservoir Dogs without Stuck in the Middle. You're
Yeah.
not going to get that scene from a log line. You're not going to get how twisted that is from Tarantino just pitching that to somebody.
Yeah. It's so true. Okay, John, time for a quick title take. We're looking at Lost in Translation. I love this title, John. I don't know about you, but it's just so fitting.
Yeah.
But let's talk about why. I mean, I'd like to get your thoughts first, real quick, about, first of all, what does this mean out of the context of the movie to you? And then in context, and is it suitable?
Out of context, I find a little trickier because so much of this story involves two people in a place that they are unfamiliar with. Now, if you took two people, these characters, if you took them from New York and threw them in Miami,
Mm-hmm.
there is a different cultural element to the United States in a place like Miami, in the same way there's a difference in Texas, and the same way there's a difference in Los Angeles versus New England or versus the Midwest. Or, every state in this country has its own unique culture to it. But we all still speak English. We're gonna understand each other. And it's not gonna be hard for these two people thrown here into this place. A title like Lost in Translation doesn't work when you take these people and put them and their problems into a place that is familiar to them. I would argue it wouldn't work if you took these characters and threw them in London. However, when you take a place that is so different culturally from the United States, like Japan, and you put these people in here, you have a significant language barrier. So I would argue that the title really only works in the context of where these characters are.
Yeah, I guess I just meant more like what does the phrase "lost in translation" actually mean in general? Just so that you don't have to be a human dictionary. I'll just read sort of the quick kind of Wiktionary thing, which is it's an idiom technically, but it's unable to be understood due to having been poorly translated. Okay, and an example: I tried reading the instruction manual, but many of the steps were unfortunately lost in translation. So I guess that's that first question about this. Is there any difference between what the regular idiom means and what the movie's meaning is pertaining to the title? Is there any leeway? Or is it just born for the title to be the title of this movie? Did Sofia hit a 10 out of 10?
It is an incredibly complicated question. I think I would stick to my guns on this, and I would agree with you. I think in terms of the title and the premise of the film, it is a 10 out of 10.
Mm-hmm.
There's no better title I can think of for a film like this, because sad upper middle class and wealthy white people in Japan doesn't have exactly the same ring to it.
Sounds like a Mad TV spoof title from a series from the early thousands.
But I think it's to an extent the title can also extend to the particular problems that these people have, and their problems are relatable, but they aren't necessarily fully relatable. I think in part because of the age difference of the characters. But it is a challenging question, because I think so much of the title does relate to the problems that they have, specifically in a place where there is a barrier of communication.
Yeah, I have to tell you, I think that this is it's a stupefyingly amazing title.
Yeah.
Right? For so many reasons, it's almost as if she started with the idiom, right? And then almost like we used to do picture prompts as kids, right? You would get a little picture, and it's of something that's sort of vague, but you can see clearly what the picture, what the subject of the picture is, and so on. And you have to write a prompt. You have to write a sort of creative narrative story uh, that that stems from what you see in the picture, and it's very interpretive, right? It's as if someone said to Coppola, I challenge you to write a movie about an idiom. Just choose one from the list. We have 5 here. All right, flat as a board. The hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. Lost in translation. She says, "Oh, yeah, all right. I think I could do that one. I think I could do Lost in Translation. Give me a few months. I'll give you some synopses, and we'll see. We'll see if we can get something going." I mean, it's just such an amazing realization in narrative form of that idiom, of that phrase, right? And I still hear people using that phrase. Something was lost in translation, but I just think that this was such prime real estate, this phrase to use as the title of a film, because we didn't really associate anything else, I think, specifically in our modern culture, right? With this phrase until this movie came out, right? And this movie has a dominating uh, it dominates the culture whenever someone utters that phrase, right? I mean, you can't even type it in Google without a million things in the drop down uh, coming up about Lost in Translation. It's hard to even find just a regular definition because it's just giving you all of the information about the film. That to me is so impressive, John. I mean, I don't know if that was her intention, but everyone, when they're writing, basically has an intention of picking the most apt title that you can, right? But this is just this is beyond that to me. I mean, right? This is beyond like just a little exercise. She absolutely nailed it. Jackpot. Lost in translation. It's just stunningly perfect. I'd like to jump right to the opening sequence and the opening image, John. First of all, the very first thing that we see is it's a shot, a very still, static shot of Charlotte. We don't know it's Charlotte yet, but a woman, a young woman, attractive woman, lying on the side of her bed, with her rear end to us in pink see-through lingerie, and it's a very lengthy shot. And I'm just going to go into the rest of the little opening sequence here. Then we'll talk about this first image. After that lengthy shot, we hear "Welcome to Tokyo International Airport," right? As it cuts to this character Bob, the actor Bill Murray, asleep in the car while being shuttled from the hotel. Shuttled from the airport to the hotel in Tokyo. And then he wakes up. He's kind of groggy in the car, and then he kind of looks out of the window, and he's impressed by these beautiful, dwarfing skyscrapers and the city lights that are all around him. And he is just kind of taking in the city life. I think he even says, "Wow." He then finally enters the hotel, and he's mobbed by these hotel personnel that are kind of hilariously over-greeting him with these like ingratiating smiles on their faces. And he's kind of annoyed by it, but he plays along. Washed up movie star, he'll do it. And he's clearly annoyed, but he just continues anyway through all these people. He makes his way from one annoying sort of greeting to another. And then he's given a fax from his wife, from one of the personnel, that he missed his son's birthday. But don't worry, he'll probably get over it, his wife Lydia says. And it's just that message, that fax is just sort of devoid of emotion. It's just like, "Hey, update, status update. You missed your son's birthday. Have a good day," basically. So I consider that sort of to be the opening sequence. So let's just begin with this opening image, John. I think in our pre-chat, you were a little bit bewildered by this opening image. So I think is it okay if I start?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Yeah, it is a bewildering image because there's kind of nothing else in the movie that's like it. At least you could say that there are sort of intimacy shots. There are like sex workers in this film. There are erotic dancers, that kind of a thing. But there's nothing that's so very static and careful, like a portrait, than this shot is. And this shot was added afterward. to be the first shot by Sophia's choice. I do know that the shot is a sort of recreation of a 20th century photorealist painter, John Crasser. He mostly painted, or at least for a long time, he went through this phase of painting midsection of females' bodies. And whether it's from the front or from the rear, I'm sorry, John Cassere, I believe it is. Kacere, for anyone wants to look it up. It's just a very impressionistic sort of image, and it's almost exactly like his paintings. And I believe I read somewhere that Cassere really wanted to challenge his spectators with trying to see not just the sexual aspect of this sort of gaping, they were oversized too. They're like 3 times life size, these gigantic oil paintings of these women's bodies. But it was a challenge to try to think about the meaning that's underneath the sort of sexual exterior, right? It's a striking, I think whether you're attracted to women or not, you look at this and it's a striking feeling that you get of, even if it's not arousal, it's just, a gaping picture of something that you don't normally see in life. And the whole point is we have this sort of striking image. It's erotic, it's sensual, but there's something underneath there. There's a human, right, with a story and a lot of emotions. And to me, because of that, it feels to me, John, like, and I also just know more of Sofia Coppola's work does this as well. There's a sort of feminine, dare I use the word, mystique, but there's an aspect of femininity. There's like an essence of femininity, a softness on the film that she shot on. It's wide. It's not very sharply focused. The colors are sort of lush and dreamy. There's a feminine sort of feeling and aspect to this opening shot, which to me kind of establishes the picture as this sort of a woman, blossoming kind of a narrative, poke to the audience. This is a story about a woman that is coming of age here, in a sense, very late adolescence. But she's trying to understand what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a married woman, what it means to be desired or wanted, what it means to get attention from a gentleman, right? And from friends. I mean, all of these things seem to change for anyone, of course, but especially as a woman going through this emotional state. And I've heard from my female friends that recently, actually, that there is a second wave of puberty that women go through. She's not quite at this age, I think, but she's approaching it, where I say around mid-20s or so, the female body changes, right? You go from less of a sort of more straight-figured girl body to more of a, not everyone has this figure, but a more curvy and filled out, full, womanly figure. And with that, not just bodily changes, but there are emotions that change as well. Hormones are released for the first time. It's a very emotional experience. And I always find that very fascinating about women. And I never thought about it to be a second puberty per se, but I feel like there's a sort of second emotional puberty that's happening here in this movie. And she's just so young to be married, and she's so young in general still, and there's so much to be discovered. And it's almost as if all of these things are colliding at once for her. And I sort of get that illustration from this opening image. What do you think about that?
I think you're getting an A+ on your film critique essay.
Yes! Gold star!
I didn't remember that shot when I saw it the first time 10 years ago.
Me neither.
I guess in terms of its inclusion, what I will say is I will call back to a conversation that you, Adam, and I had when I saw Blue Velvet for the first time with both of you during the pandemic.
Yeah.
which was that I didn't understand everything I experienced in that film. But it was told so cohesively that although I didn't understand some things inclusions, I know that the director did. I know that the filmmakers did.
Mhm.
There is a sort of confidence that certain films have with its inclusion in something that even if you don't understand, you can feel while you're watching it that its inclusion was warranted and necessary because the director knew what they were doing. The director
Right.
knew what it meant, whether explicitly or implicitly, based on intellect versus intuition,
Right.
either or both, depending on the circumstances. It makes sense, even though I don't understand it. It was a head scratcher when I went back and learned, and I'm like, this is a very specific shot, and it does elicit a lot of feelings. And while it begins as a very male gaze type of shot, it holds for so long that it forces you to think about it in different contexts.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting
Yeah,
when you stare at something for long enough. It's kind of like that little game that people play where you keep saying the same word
yeah,
over and over again, right? If I said feminism over and over, right, for about 5 minutes, eventually there's that moment, right, where we forget what the word even means. And then you're forced to really break that word apart and just sort of put every single association that you can connect to that word back together again on your own and sort of create your own individual meaning out of the word because you're forced to, as opposed to merely being led by just some sort of like, you know, denotative idea that we
yeah.
all use as sort of shorthand intelligence when we're speaking. And, we don't want any of that to be lost in translation, of course.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it is an
Hey, I
interesting
see.
act. Did you see what I did? Another gold star. I got two now.
Yeah.
This is exciting.
The king of puns approves.
So let's quickly touch on the rest of that sequence, and then we'll go right into scenic view from there. Okay, scenic view, of course, for those of you new to the podcast, is where we take a look at the movie from a sort of bird's eye view, and we zoom out, and then we select specific scenes to zoom in on and talk about their meaning and how they have a very important significance to the film in terms of the meaning. And then we'll zoom out again and then zoom back in on whatever scene we would like to choose after that. So, how do you think that this exposition of the Bob character, of the actor, what kind of an idea do we have about this character? How do we snap into the tone? And what is she establishing here? And then how does that contribute to the beginning of Bob's arc?
You said something about Bob's personality in the beginning. I think when he's driving through what I believe is Shibuya, and he's looking at all of the signs. I think you said he was excited.
He was impressed by the city lights and the city life.
Yeah. So I'm
Yeah.
I'm going to disagree with you on that interpretation.
Sure.
I think he was overwhelmed. I don't think he was
Mm-hmm.
impressed
Mm-hmm.
because especially before now, traveling to Japan can be quite a culture shock. Tokyo and Japan are quite different than many places in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
The closest I can think of that the United States has to Tokyo is New York City. It is a big, sprawling metropolis. But
Mm-hmm.
Tokyo is so much bigger than New York.
Mm-hmm.
And New York is on a very specific grid system. Many of the buildings don't have advertising blatantly on the buildings in the same way that these buildings in Shibuya do, and many of these buildings all over urban centers in Japan do. The closest thing we have in New York is Times Square.
Mm-hmm.
You see it a little bit in media, but until you're actually there, it's a hard thing to articulate. nothing prepares you for the first time that you go to a city like Tokyo. It is quite overwhelming. So I would argue for Bob Harris, a 52-year-old man who's probably been in America for most of his life and only doing like the press junkets in other countries when he's had to, and it's usually a very chaperoned affair.
Yeah.
You go to a place that is so different than what you understand, especially in your middle age, it's going to be considerably overwhelming.
Yeah, that's probably a great correction, a great fix. As we shift into scenic view gear here, I just have to say that like I love so many of these little moments that Coppola constructs that give us ideas and set tone and give us the interior, I would say, of the characters with external images. One of the funny ones that happens right away is right after this opening sequence when Bob when Bob's in the elevator and there's just the static shot of him waiting, right? While the elevator's moving up, and all of the Japanese men around him are like a foot and a half shorter. And they must have had him standing on an apple box or something, just to kind of, give it that extra disparity, if you will. But it's just so funny to me because, first of all, his face, he's just kind of miserable, right? Not that people are mostly happy in an elevator anyway, but the way that she's framed this, I believe we're on his eye line, and everyone else seems to be even shorter that way too. And it's not just feeding into this stereotype about how East Asians are a bit shorter than Americans. But in the context of the story, he's just so out of place. And like you said just now, I mean, he this is his first time ostensibly, right, traveling to Japan, let alone to Tokyo, and he's just not used to this environment. And I love what you said earlier about how, when we were talking about the title, about how going to a place that's so foreign in so many ways actually like wrings the troubles of these characters out. It brings it out of them. It's like a catalyst in and of itself, the environment, in order to sort of isolate what is wrong with these characters' lives and what makes them unsatisfied. And it's just these images. It's funny, sure, but it's evocative of that kind of exposition where it doesn't just tell us about Bob, but it is setting the tone. And she's already giving us this idea that the place itself is a catalyst for what you're about to see. Everything kind of suggests that. His interactions with everyone, his demeanor, his very, kind of morose demeanor, counteracting everything that happens around him. The ridiculous smiles and the chatter and the excitement of everyone coming to see him. It contends with his demeanor, and she uses all of these juxtapositions very well. He also doesn't like to be recognized in the bar. Just after that, right, when we hear the audio of those two guys that are recognized. Oh, is that him? Oh no, it looks like him, but it's not him. No, it's him. Come on, that's got to be him. And they say his name, and he looks up, and he just spends a second talking to them, and he just wants to leave, right? So even the other Americans in the hotel seem to be bothering him. So again, she's just isolating his condition further and further and further to the audience. It's very clear, very concise communication to us about what's going on, visually and otherwise. So, John, I'd like to hone in on this scene, and then I'd like to go to wherever you would like to go after this. But since we're talking about exposition, the exposition of Charlotte happens right after this first lounge singer scene. We see Bob just kind of drinking or whatever. And then he goes back to his room. Then we see Charlotte sitting by the window, and Sophia, repeats this shot several times throughout the movie, of Charlotte sitting at the window frame, of their very high hotel room, where you can see this beautiful scenic view of much of Tokyo, and she's just sort of I don't know, lamenting. She's reflecting. She can't sleep. But how does this exposition, this first shot of at least the face of the front end of Charlotte, how does Sofia Coppola give us what we need to know here? And why do you think that she repeats this shot throughout the story?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd argue, in a similar sense, it's a way she is showcasing that Charlotte is overwhelmed by her surroundings, the same way that Bob Harris is overwhelmed by his surroundings. Because
Yeah.
when we introduce Charlotte this way, she's sitting in the window, looking over just the sprawling metropolis that is, Tokyo, and it just goes on for as far as you can see. And you see all the skyscrapers, but you see all the little homes as well. And there is just not an inch of free space beyond the parks and the roads. It's a unique contrast to showcase her sense of overwhelming. But while Bob is moving, he's in a vehicle
Mm-hmm.
moving to and from, and he's being ushered by the staff who are working with him on his commercial. She's primarily static. She's in a room. She's essentially a bird in a cage. She feels trapped, and I think we get that confirmation later in the scene between her and Bob when they're in bed together
Mm-hmm.
after they are drinking and watching movies. To me, she really does feel like a character who is trapped. She's trapped in what she wants to do. She's trapped in her very unfulfilling marriage, and she herself is overwhelmed.
Yeah.
That's my take on that.
I agree. Yeah, I think it's a good interpretation. I think this is such an effective image to show us that idea. I mean, we have this person that's looking out over it's such a big city that it almost looks like you're just looking at the world.
Yeah.
You're looking at society, right, with a capital S. And it's as if this character is just pondering, oh, look at all of these buildings below. They're so far from me. Look at all of these people, these cars, this hustle and bustle, this movement, the momentum. People are moving in their lives. The things are happening. Lives are being lived. People are meeting each other. People are doing work, their jobs, and so on. And she's just so far away from all of it and isolated from it. She doesn't know where she's going to land in that big vastness that is the world below her. And it's so overwhelming, even as a viewer, just to see this shot of her in the foreground and this unbelievable metropolis behind her. And you just think to yourself, where is this person going to fall? And that's what she's thinking too. And later on in the film, she says something along the lines of, I just don't know what I'm supposed to be. When you see something that vast from that far away, you see everything. Speaking of overwhelmed, you see, like I said, every job, every setting, every building, every car. And when you see everything at once, I think it gives us the idea as viewers that she's thinking about everything at once. And that induces a lot of anxiety and a lot of pressure on a character, right? I mean, I'm sure you've done it, but whenever I think about everything in my own life at once, where I want to go, what I want to do with my life, with my career, with my marriage, all of this stuff, it's as if I'm thinking about a vast metropolis, with a complicated topography, and connective tissue from one thing to another that's so intricate that I just can't understand it. And it becomes very overwhelming. That's very clearly related to me here, and I just think it's a stunning, clear image. And I think that's why she uses it throughout, too. That feeling, I think, doesn't go away in Charlotte. even though she finds some sort of romance with Bob, if that's what you can call it, that feeling is still there. It's the chip on her shoulder. She can't shake that. So it keeps us in the headspace of that character. I want to work toward here, John, through scenes, how we make sense of this relationship, this romance kindling here. So to do this, let's visit the commercial Centauri shoot. What did you think about this scene as it exposes even more about Bob, and also Sophia's style as well here, John? Because again, he's here to do this commercial for the whiskey, and we have this eccentric director that's in the that's directing him. They're having translation problems, right? He's having trouble kind of understanding, and in fact, even in our pre-chat, you said that you were able to understand what the director was basically actually saying. So, what did you think of this scene, and how does it outline how we get, who Bob is, even more so in the first act of the movie?
What's fascinating to me about the scene is when you don't understand Japanese, you are with Bob. And you have this very eccentric director who is firing off, a syllable a millisecond. And once again, it is overwhelming. If you, even speaking as much Japanese as I understand, when I'm encountering words in Japanese that I don't know and I lose track of the conversation, it can be overwhelming. Now, it's overwhelming for different reasons, but when you can't understand a person, it is frustrating, even when you speak the same language. And the translator gives you the most basic translation possible.
Is she actually translating, though? Is she reliably accurate? Is she distilling what he's actually saying?
So I couldn't help but laugh because it's like, is that all he said? It's like, well, she's not wrong. That is what he said.
Okay. Good. So that answers my question.
It is just
Actually.
the absolute most basic. No details, no flourish, nothing that really helps an actor do their job.
Right. Look at the camera.
Yeah, it's
Look at the
literally,
camera
yeah,
and say
she
the
literally
name.
says,
Yeah.
look at the camera. And to be fair, in the first time she says, look in the camera. But she doesn't say, look in the camera and, say the line. Whereas the director says something, I believe, akin to like, slowly look in the camera as if you're talking to a friend and say Suntory time. That's roughly what I was able to gather from watching that scene.
Uh-huh.
Now, the second tangent the director goes on, tangent, because it's really just his direction.
Mm-hmm.
Bob says, oh, do I look from the left? Do I look from the right? These are actor things.
Yeah.
He's frustrated. He needs more direction on what to do, and he's not getting it. And the director, when the translator starts asking about this direction, the director gets very frustrated. And one of the things he says is, we don't have time. Like, we don't have time for this. That is something that isn't translated to Bob. She just gives him a little more direction than before, like more intensely. Look at camera, like friend.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, is that really all? And it's like, well, yes. You don't need to know that the director is upset that they're behind schedule.
Mm-hmm.
So it does become somewhat humorous when you start looking at it from a translation perspective as well.
Yeah, it's very humorous.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, like, she's not wrong.
What's interesting to me about this is that the film starts out more sort of sardonically funny, and then it becomes less funny as a predicament, as plot in the movie, as much as the Murray character himself taking on a persona of charm and wit,
Yeah.
funny wit. And that is what carries the movie in a, if you can say, comedy sense from here on out, right? So that shift is interesting to me. To me, that kind of says a lot about what, this movie does to its character Bob, right? Because first, it's a funny predicament. Oh, is that all she said? That's a funny little plot point, right? That's what happens. But then less and less funny things start to actually happen. The strangeness of it, right? The quirkiness of the situation becomes less laughable, and it kind of shifts into this is blossoming into some kind of a serious romance. And I think it's interestingly exemplified by the character, because the character himself, once he starts to feel more comfortable with her, starts to make her laugh and make us laugh, just by kind of watching her laugh with him. We're not laughing at the movie. We're laughing along with Charlotte because we know that she's being charmed. And there's something adorable about that. And it's kind of fascinating how adorable it is, because we're talking about a 50-year-old man and a 24-year-old young woman. But so that commercial shoot definitely gives us the place of, yeah, like you said, the title. It definitely gives us the attitude. It's fun to see Bob's element at work here, right? He's in his element. He's doing his thing, his actor thing. But there's something just not right. It's not even just the predicament that he's in. He just seems, he's very sarcastic. He's sort of mocking everything in the photo shoot, which happens after this. He's sort of, making his little joke saying, yeah, well, if I had my whiskey, I would be, for real, I'd be smiling. He's making fun of the job. It's the least exciting thing to him, seemingly, while he's there, and it's what he's there to do. So that is just kind of a very, it's a cool way to show first act Bob, and his just disenchantment with life and disenchantment with his job.
Yeah, and it does also showcase in a way, and this is something we can probably talk about later in the episode, because there is, there are certain things in this film that are not viewed as favorably by audiences, most predominantly pertaining to the way that Japan was represented in this film. But in this first act, it's subtle, but on top of being overwhelmed, I sometimes think what people tend to miss too is that while Bob is overwhelmed, it's not an excuse to be a dick.
Mm-hmm.
He's there for a job. He agreed to do this job. He needs to treat it like a job, and he's not treating it like a job.
Right.
He does it, but he's doing it in a manner that is kind of rude.
Right.
And so it's interesting. Well, like I said, we'll probably get into that later.
Yeah.
Towards the end, but it is an interesting way to showcase too that Bob is, if we're going on the scale of the hero's journey and the way that a character changes over time,
mm-hmm.
it's a very good example to me of writing. He is dismissive. He's disrespectful when he does the Suntory time shot again. He does it the way he's directed because he's a professional. But while he's taking a drink, he also is rolling his eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And he does it just enough that they get what they need to do it, but he still can't cover up his disdain for what he's doing and why he's doing it there. And so it's interesting to showcase his before this way, because he's not a flagrant asshole in the beginning of the film.
Right.
He's just a jaded, overwhelmed, middle-aged man who is unhappy.
Right.
And he showcases it as such. So it's
right.
It's also refreshing because it, in a sense, makes him a bit easier to like, because he doesn't start off the film at a 10 in terms of irredeemability.
Mm-hmm.
He is at worst a guy who's having not a great week.
Right. She doesn't dial too much of it in, so that he becomes an abhorrent character. Yeah, of course.
Even if he's being paid $2 million to do a commercial, which is more money than most people would see in their lives for 1 week of work.
Right. Yeah, so let's bounce back to
Yeah.
Charlotte. So a couple scenes, right? We're just kind of chime jumping here a little bit. But Charlotte goes on her own when her husband John kind of, vamooshes off to wherever he's going for his shoot. She goes to some sort of, I guess, greater local, greater Tokyo area, and visits a monastery where she sees these monks, and she tells her mother or sister, whoever it is, that she didn't feel anything. And I love how in that scene she actually has trouble even navigating through the public transit. Folks are bumping into her. She's confused. She's looking around. It's like she doesn't know where she is. It's just hard to get through the crowd. It's hard to just even take a little day trip to herself. And then later on, she takes another trip out to Kyoto where she sees a wedding, like a traditional sort of wedding happening over there. And then just some other quick moments. She's listening to a soul searching CD, right? She also takes, I'm just talking about the time where she's kind of off on her own. She cries, talking with, like I said, her mother or her sister about how she doesn't understand her husband. She also sees Anna Faris, Kelly's character, just sort of being very inauthentic and sort of laughing at her and making fun of her. How do all of these things add up to her, add up to first act and even second act Charlotte?
Well, the interesting thing about Charlotte, especially with the scene where she goes to the shrine and sees the Buddhists, it tells me that she is searching for meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And she's also a character who is attempting to make the most of her time here because she decides to get out of her cage. And it's interesting because she seems to be most free both when she's with Bob but also when she's not around her husband. Even
Mm-hmm.
if the trips and the excursions don't seem to bear any fruit for her, she has her own agency in these scenes.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas she seems to lack agency when she's around her husband, with the exception of the scene where they're at the dinner table, her, Kelly, herself, and the rapper who just is a guy who breathes oxygen. Then she gets up and goes over and talks to Bob. And I believe that's after they've had their first scene together, which would make sense that she has some agency there.
Yeah.
When she's around her husband as opposed to before when she doesn't.
Right.
But I think her searching for meaning and her attempts at finding meaning is what those scenes represent.
Mm-hmm.
She also stumbles upon a flower arrangement ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
While she is kind of ushered along in it, engages in it in not 100% by her choice, it seemed to at least resonate in some capacity because she starts decorating her hotel room
Mm-hmm.
with that at one point.
Yeah.
So
Maybe some sort of a desperation.
Yeah, I would argue that. I think desperation is a good way to phrase it, but I think all of those scenes ultimately showcase her searching for meaning, but it also showcases that she is in some capacity a bit more adventurous than Bob because she is willing to go out and make the most of her time when she's in Tokyo, whereas Bob, until Charlotte invites him out for their night on the town, Bob spends it just drinking in the hotel bar.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas she's at least making an attempt to go out and explore.
Yeah, and that leads us to the next sort of step in their relationship, which is where they do get to talking, which is a really interesting conversation. He's charming her, they just sort of, there's something that, because she buys him a drink originally. So there's something that kind of either attracts her or just attracts her attention. She finds him somehow interesting in a world and a place where just nothing is interesting. Remember, she says she doesn't feel anything at the monastery. Well, clearly she feels something when she meets him. She doesn't quite know what it is, but something excites her it makes her feel things inside. It's a fascination, perhaps at first. Perhaps it's even a physical attraction. Who knows? But there's enough of a curiosity and enough of a sort of emotional output there for her to reach out to him. So then she finally walks over to him. They talk. He's funny. They kind of hit it off, and he just kind of has this vibe of like, she's a good kid. I'll talk to her. But then she invites him to go out, and then we have this really different kind of sequence then from the rest of the film, where they go out for a night out on the town,
Yeah.
and they start meeting friends. And Bob is wearing a T-shirt for the first time. He's not in a boring suit or tuxedo or work shirt or polo or whatever it is. He wears a T-shirt. He gets out there. He has a great time. He finally starts to like the city a little bit. How does Coppola shift I guess I wouldn't say the tone, but how does she shift into some kind of a new gear here in every way in the movie, in the imagery, in the pace, in the music, the rhythm? How is she giving us something new? The emotional aspects of the characters. What effect does that have on us, and why is it all happening? What is going on here between these two characters?
So, what I love about this scene and the way that we transition into it is the first thing we really get is he shows up in this orange and yellow and gray camouflage style T-shirt, which Charlotte basically refers to as like a midlife crisis T-shirt.
Yeah.
And so Bob, a little hurt, he takes it off, he turns it inside out and makes it look more like a normal yellow T-shirt. What's funny to me about that scene is that is, I think, the start of showcasing the lighter side of Bob. And that is a key part of his change as a character. It's part of his character development. He does have a slightly goofy side, but he's also still concerned with what people think. So he's not so bothered by it that he takes it off and puts on a button down, but he does turn the shirt inside out to make it look like a more normal T-shirt, and then he wears his jacket over it. But what they do from there is they go to this kind of club-like scene, and they meet up with Charlotte's friends. And what's most telling is they go out and they let Charlotte's friends lead them to where they're going. And they seem to have a great time. The two parts of this sequence that really get me the most here are when they get to one of the clubs, and it's a bit more of a low-key bar type place. And Bob is talking to a Japanese man, and you can't catch what they're saying too much, but they're speaking French. They're both speaking French together. That's really interesting to me that they chose not to have a Japanese man speaking English, Bob's tongue. They chose to have both of them speak French.
Mm-hmm.
They had a common interest, and they engage in it together. And you see Bob is genuinely engaged.
Mm-hmm.
And he's not being a dick. He's not, he doesn't seem overwhelmed, even though this is obviously his first night out in the Japanese club scene.
Mm-hmm.
He seems more at ease. He's not even particularly fazed when Charlotte's friend kind of starts a fight with a bartender, and the bartender pulls a BB gun on them and starts shooting at them to get out of the club.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second part that really gets me is the karaoke part, is the karaoke room.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because I remember I started getting a little emotional watching him sing his song, because as he starts singing, Bill Murray's not a bad singer as an outside.
Yeah.
But by proxy, that means Bob Harris is not a bad singer. And he's really enjoying singing with these newfound friends that he's made.
Yeah.
And it's the first time in the film, and it's communicated that this is probably the first time in years where Bob Harris has genuinely felt alive.
Right.
And it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. And there's something exciting and mysterious about that, right? And it's just it seems like it's completely improvised, right? And that's something that he just doesn't have in his life, apparently, right? And for the younger people listening to this, I mean, that might be very familiar to you. This sequence, that is your life, right? That is sort of Charlotte's life in a way, but in a more contained, extreme kind of a way. But you're trying to improvise your way through existence and trying new things, meeting new people, going to the excitement, having some fun, not knowing what tomorrow's going to bring. And I think that this harkens back to what Bob says to her later on when they really connect in bed, where they're just lying in bed next to each other talking, where he says, the more you know who you are and the more you know what you want, the less exciting things become. That's what he says to her. And that's the wisdom that he's brought. It's sort of, unfortunate wisdom, but we can see this being countered in his life right now in this moment, in this sequence, having fun. She puts on a wig because why not? And they sit in this hallway together that's really strange looking because why not? And it turns out that
But it was the bathroom.
It turns out it was the bathroom, of course. Like, oh, how romantic. But that's the whole point. It's like, when you're doing that, anything goes. The only thing that doesn't go is the boring, predictable crap, right? Let's just run from someone shooting at us. Let's see where we end up. Let's see who we meet. Why not? Let's sing a song. That hasn't happened tonight yet, right? I mean, the whole feeling of that presented to us in this the whole movie is very, in the cinema verite tradition, I would say, the cinema of truth, these simplistic sort of handheld moments, just following these characters through one domain of their lives to another, but just following them along almost as if it's just a documentary from one place to another, capturing these little moments. It's so exciting. And you're right, when we see Bill Murray, when we see Bob singing that song, he's free. He's let go. He's soaring, And I love Charlotte's reaction to him singing. There's a great shot where she's out of focus in the background, but we know how she's looking at him. And that's masterful. And they rack the focus to Charlotte, and it turns out she is reacting the way that we thought she was when she was just a bokeh blur. But that was so cool. What a way to show that. She can see him becoming alive again. She knows who he is at that point, and she sees the change. And he also sees the change in her, right? Because on her side, she's wearing this wig, she's laughing. Remember he makes this comment later on where he says, oh, when I saw you in the elevator, you smiled. And then that smile, I haven't seen that smile since, or something like that. Right? So they know what each other is going through, even before they explain the details of it to each other. But what's happening in this scene is a synergy and an energy, not just with each other, but by themselves, right? They're each coming out of some kind of a shell. And they're starting to realize, I think, that it's not just the place. Right? It's not that Tokyo itself is boring and overwhelming and bad or whatever it is, dreary. It's how you apply yourself into it. And it's also this idea that you get when we're talking about, if you've ever heard about people talking about dating or relationships that go really well, or just hanging out with a friend that really gets you or something like that. Isn't it interesting, John, how when you hang out with someone that you really like, whether it's a friend or romantic interest, the most menial things become the most beautiful and memorable things, right? Sitting outside of a bathroom, like you were just saying. This weird, strange room, this little tiny hallway, weird decorations, but she's wearing her wig, and they feel it becomes like another iconic image in the scene, is when she puts her head on his shoulders. And we get this beautiful two-shot of them just enjoying existing together. I mean, that's so hard to achieve in life. Just finding someone that you enjoy existing with that much, sitting outside of a bathroom. I mean, that's where that that iconic two shot takes place. It's not the glorious Mount Fuji. It's not in front of one of these incredible buildings with these lights, right? It's not on the photo shoot, which is very exciting being on set. It's outside of a bathroom in a club that just has no like purpose in the rest of the movie. I love that. And Coppola creates that from thin air. She captures that, she puts it in the right moment, and she's communicating to us what's happening to these characters. They are creating something together. And at this point, they've connected well enough where I think it doesn't matter where they go, a store, a bathroom, a weird bar, a hallway, a hotel, it doesn't matter. Any place that they go to together sparkles. And we feel that chemistry, we feel that energy. And that's pretty amazing. So, where does this go even after that, John, is where it goes to the bed. They have this conversation. I call this, John, the de facto sex scene, right? But it's not a sex scene. It's the scene where in any other movie that's like this, any love story, any romance with adults, they're going to have sex. You know? At this point in the movie, we're like nearing the third act or whatever it is, maybe even the third act. They're really opening up to each other. They're understanding each other. They're being intimate in that they're telling each other intimate things, their life philosophies, but they're also beginning to sort of touch each other, you know, respectfully. Bill Murray puts his hand on her foot. And instead of having sex, this is a substitute for that. They fall asleep together with her in this sort of like fetal position, very vulnerable, and him putting his hand on her foot. And it almost has the same effect on us as a viewer as watching two people that love each other be very physically intimate. What did you think about? How did that make you feel with this scene? And just the alternative nature of that. The fact that they don't ever actually have sex.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's ultimately more appropriate, and for a film from 2003,
Forgetting the time though. Why is it
no, I
appropriate
think
for the story?
well, I think it's extremely appropriate for the story because of the type of story they're telling and the subtleties that they're playing on. But it is interesting, given the context that it's a film from 2003, because most filmmakers would have that go into a sex scene.
Right.
And Sofia Coppola chooses not to. I've heard this film described in some ways as the wrong time for lovers, but the right time as soulmates.
Huh.
Which is an interesting take. But there's something about this that I think goes beyond just the interpretation of these characters being romantically involved. And I think that these are two people who fulfill a hole in their lives that they are missing. And it doesn't have to be a form of sexuality or even necessarily romantic love. I took the scene to some extent as actually being more platonic. These are just two people who get each other.
Yeah.
They understand.
Mm-hmm.
Charlotte's husband is honestly he's a very disappointing character, and this is something else we can touch upon too at the end because I have my thoughts on him too. But he's a very disappointing character because he's an artist, and in the same vein, whereas artists are usually a bit more cultured and at least exposed a bit more culturally, this guy just doesn't give a shit at all.
Mm-hmm.
He's a bit of a weasel, and it's kind of a miracle that a guy like that became a photographer and was being flown around to photograph, rock stars in Japan when there are plenty of Japanese photographers who are just as good as this guy that get it.
Right. Well, there's that idea of, just because someone's really good, or just because someone is, of a certain country, or basically it's this whole separation between like your career and your personal life, right?
Yeah.
Just because he's very neglectful and weaselly as a person, as a husband, say, that has no bearing on whether he's, a great photographer.
Yeah.
Maybe he's not as mousy and weaselly when he's on set and working, and he's just. I know a lot of people that are like this, right? People that are just incredible at what they do for an occupation, a career. And then when it comes to their personal lives, it's just a mess, right? So that there could be that
Yeah.
there.
But nonetheless, he is a very disappointing character
Hmm.
for her in her life, and that could ultimately boil down to just them being incompatible.
Hmm.
But Bob gets it because Bob is having his own problems.
Yeah.
And the thing about Bob that's also interesting is while he and his wife are clearly at each other's throats, what got me is Bob still makes attempts with his wife.
Hmm.
He could have exclusively communicated by fax, but instead, when his phone rings and it's his wife, he answers it.
Yeah.
And he's not great, but the thing is that they still try.
Yeah.
However, like you said, it's a loveless marriage. They're staying together for the kids, is what
Hmm.
it seems like.
Yeah.
There is somewhat of a lack of empathy in their partners.
Hmm.
And these two people can empathize with each other because they are both going through something similar in a way that's unique to them.
But to
They
be
can,
fair, right, Charlotte's husband does send her a fax with a little heart and says, I love you and I miss you or whatever. He does say, I love you when he leaves her and kisses her, however awkwardly. But are you saying there's something different? What is different about her and Bob than her and her husband? I mean, you said that they get each other. That's I guess that's the answer,
yeah,
right?
these are two people who are miserable in their marriages and they feel isolated because it's not working.
Yeah.
And her husband could be sending that fax as a form of manipulation.
Mm,
He seems like he's holding on as opposed to being genuine in
right.
it. And nonetheless, the parallel to that for Bob is when his wife mails a bunch of different carpet options, and it says, "Here are a number of different options for your study."
Hmm.
So she's clearly thinking about something that is important to Bob. And
Yeah.
she gives some input, but she also says, I like the burgundy, but it's ultimately up to you.
Hmm.
So I would argue that was Bob's wife's attempt at the I love you message that John sends. Yeah, again, based on John's personality, he seems like he's holding on and he's doing what the kids today call love bombing.
Hmm.
It's a grandiose display. Somebody who's secure, they're not doing that. They're not going to fax a giant heart that says "Love you, can't wait to see you." Maybe,
Hmm.
maybe everybody's different.
Overcompensation, maybe,
Yeah,
right? Love
it
bombing.
comes off as an overcompensation rather than a
Right.
place of being genuine.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
I
that's
think I
interesting.
think John thinks it's kind of over too.
Yeah. There's almost this feeling that he feels even more attracted to the LA vibe, more attracted to Kelly, for example. He's more willing to engage in these sort of, uh, empty, immature sort of conversations about nothing, about power cleansing, as opposed
And
to what I think Charlotte wants to talk about, which is her real spiritual journey in life, more lofty things. She's a graduate of what was it, Yale.
yeah,
She's a philosophy major. She's clearly a deep thinker, and I think that her husband is quite shallow.
yeah, and John even says that too. He says something. I'm paraphrasing, but he says something along the lines of like, "What is it? Like maybe you'd like LA more if you didn't judge people all the time."
Right.
But
And
he
she even
says,
says that John about her husband at some point that he thinks that she's snobby. Remember?
Yeah.
So let's go to the closing, John, because we've gone over the basic romance and these sort of basic framings of these characters and how Coppola has done that for us, and that feeds into the meaning of the ultimate meaning of the movie, which I still want to really ask you about and get like a totally distilled answer. Because that's so interesting to me always to see what's going on with that, especially with a movie that has a lot less, let's say, narrative real estate than a lot of other movies that we've talked about and most other movies that kind of exist from Hollywood. I just want to go over this closing sequence first, and then we'll talk about the sequence, and we'll talk quickly about the final image. So, Bob says sort of a quiet goodbye to Charlotte in the hotel lobby, right? They're kind of surrounded by other people. It seems rushed. He doesn't really get his chance to, say exactly what's on his mind. He's got to go. He can't find her. And then they kind of have this like very platonic goodbye. Bob is being then driven to the airport, and he sees Charlotte walking away in a crowd. He stops the car, and he gets out, and he goes to her. He stops her, and she turns around, and she's very happy to see him. If you notice, she already has like these glassy kind of eyes when she turns around, as if she was sort of, sad and lamenting already, just missing him already. So she's surprised to see him. He hugs her warmly. She's kind of stunned, doesn't know what to do. He takes the action to hug her, and he really hugs her intensely. She starts to cry. He's emotional but doesn't cry, but you can tell that he really is going to miss her. And she, of course, says that she's going to miss him earlier. But then he says something incomprehensible into her ear. He sort of whispers it, and we don't hear what it is. But she reacts by saying, okay. Something is reassured. And then they kiss a couple times. She started cries a little bit more. And he leaves her. Both of them smiling on their way toward whatever the next phase of their life is. But both of them smiling in these last moments, catching eyes at each other multiple times, looking back. And then Bob gets into the car and drives away. And there's a POV shot of the city, or multiple shots which match the opening of the movie. And then sort of these shots of the car making its way through the traffic to the airport. And we fade out from this wide shot of Bob in the car, of Bob's car in the traffic, and seeing these looming buildings. And we fade to black there. So what do you think about this closing, John? First of all, the gaping question, what do you think that she says to him? Or excuse me, what do you think that he says to her to elicit that reaction? And why is this a fitting ending to the movie regarding what she wants us to get out of it, the meaning of it?
I thought a lot about that ending. And it's one of the things that I've thought about frequently from the first time I saw it 10 years ago. And some people might think that this is a cop-out, but I think when you choose as a writer and when you choose as a director to convey information to the audience, the choice that they made to not subtitle the Japanese dialogue in the Suntory commercial versus if they were to, you communicate something different to the audience when you choose to convey information or you choose to leave it vague and ambiguous. I don't think it matters what he says. It only matters how he made her feel. That's why we're not told as the audience. That's why it is unintelligible to us. It's something private. It's something between just the two of them.
Yeah.
Because the context of the scene doesn't change whether we know it or not. I mean, obviously, if he were to say something like, I hate your guts and I hope your plane crashes, obviously that has a different scene. But they're not going to do that because that's stupid.
Among other things. But yeah.
But whatever he does say to her, it is within the theme and the climax of their relationship that they've experienced during this week in Japan together.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe the kiss, I could be wrong. I've heard that that was an ad lib from Bill Murray.
Hmm.
My take on this scene is that the whispering in the ear was supposed to be the equivalent of the Hollywood kiss.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that them lying in bed together is the way that Sofia Coppola subverts the Hollywood sex scene and the consummation of this relationship, him whispering in her ear is the subversion of the big classic Hollywood kiss.
Right.
And that's why it doesn't matter what he says. That's why we don't need to know what he says.
Mm-hmm.
Because whatever he says, it elicits a specific reaction, and it's the summation of everything that these two have been together on this journey.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. I thought it was a deeply affecting
It
ending.
is. It's extremely affecting.
And I think that the whole fact that it's affecting at all is a testament to what this movie is trying to mean and trying to say. Right? I from this final moment, just the fact that I felt so much for these people and the characters feel a lot in this moment, and yet it doesn't amount to this sort of Hollywood romance. The fact that those things can still be reaped from this scene goes to show you that every single moment in life, or even every single week, to be fair, in your life is so consequential. It seems like things might be, when things get a little bit tough for you, or you're just not having a great week, that can be very consequential. But then at the same time, something can happen the next week where you look back and you think, wow, that actually wasn't a terrible week. This happened. And whatever that thing happened was, it blossoms into something else in your life that becomes extremely meaningful and important, right? In the same way that Bob arrived here as a disaffected actor trying to do a whiskey ad, right? But he leaves the city having done the ad, which is utterly predictably boring for him. But he leaves the city a changed person. He leaves the city invigorated and replenished by something that is completely unpredictable, right? Something that even seems innocuous. It's just a young woman that you met and had some conversations with. You met her in the elevator, you had a drink with her, and then you left. Nothing happened, of course, sexually, but this is a friend. Now this is a person that really means something to you. This is going to be a story that he will have been able to tell for the rest of his life. He might never get her out of his mind, even not in a romantic way, but just in a powerfully connecting to another human way, right? So I get the idea from this ending that there's this kind of life is transient kind of a lesson, right? Moments are fast. Relationships are fast. Life moves fast. And it just keeps going. Just like the cars and the people of Tokyo, right? It's a constantly moving body. But as transient as things are, we really have to sit back and understand that there is meaning in every little fiber, And these relationships can blossom from anywhere. And no matter how jaded you are, no matter how hopeless you are, no matter how stuck or lost you feel, I feel like she's saying anything can blossom at any point, right? And it's about finding people that get you. I love what you said about that. That's what good relationships are, whether they're romantic or whether they're not. It's about spending time with people that get you and they're easy to be around, and that can come from anywhere. Life has a way of surprising you. And I thought that was immensely powerful. It's always ironic to me how these kinds of ideas can be so much more powerful than like that classical Hollywood kiss with the swell of music and you feel so so much sort of secondhand romance and elation from these people when they kiss,
Yeah.
or when they have like the sex scene and the cigarette and all this kind of stuff. Like those are cliches for a reason, right? But this movie gives us all of that emotion, but in something that seems to be so innocuous. And that's what's magical about this. That's the power of alternative filmmaking, I think, the power of indie filmmaking. And the other thing about this ending, John, is that, or the whole movie rather, is that you said that you had seen it a long time ago. The last time I saw this movie was also a very long time ago, late teenager, maybe. And I was transfixed by it for some reason, but I couldn't understand why. Now I see this again and I'm thinking to myself, God, do I get it? I really do get this. I felt lost. I felt stuck now in the world, especially after graduating. When you realize, when you are trying to be something and someone, and it seems like such a distant achievement, and you don't know how to get it, or if you even know what you want to do at all. Sometimes I've just doubted myself as to what do I even really want to be. I mean, to truly know what that feels like is quite a thing, and to be able to have felt that now and rewatched this movie is astonishing. All the different other emotions that are more complicated that come into play here when I see this ending, having been gone through some of life now. I wanted to ask you a question about this ending, John, and it's a fascinating one. I'm just wondering, like, these people are so filled with emotion that they're just not probably never going to see each other again, right? As far as I can tell, they don't share their contact information. It's just sort of a one-off thing. This was magical. Let's not destroy the magic of it. She even says by coming back, because it'll never be as fun. This is the moment we're living in. This is the magic of it, the unpredictability of it. But the question is, would that even happen now in the age of social media and in the age of everyone having the internet on the rectangle in their pocket? Because I think the whole reason that there's so much like energy, emotional energy at the end of this movie, in this sequence, is that they truly feel like they're never going to see each other again, right? So my question is, does this happen anymore in such a such a purely emotional way? Because nowadays people would just say, "Oh, what's your Instagram handle?" Right? Would they just exchange Facebook handles, Instagram, Snapchat, whatever it is? Um, Even if there's such a big age difference, pretty much all ages have social media now. All ages that would are relevant to this story, at least. Uh, wouldn't they just exchange that and then watch each other's social media channels and feeds and see what's happening in their lives and the images that they upload and everything? We don't get these moments as much anymore. So, how does the entire feel of this ending change being living in the world that we live in today?
I'm going to disagree.
Mm,
This to me would be so in the context of Bob and Charlotte and the relationship that they have, their age, where they are in their life, and specifically movie star
hmm
element. That would be like one of my trips to Japan 6 years ago when I was 25. That would be like me developing something like this with Marissa Tomei.
right.
Do you think Marissa Tomei or somebody like a Marissa Tomei, do you think realistically something like that would happen? And I think the answer is it would get really complicated. And
hmm
honestly, sometimes things aren't meant to last forever.
Yeah.
Sometimes both people can agree maturely, like adults, that this week that we had was fulfilling because it was a limited span of time.
hmm
If we extend this, it will be different. Now, a lot of people don't heed that, and it gets messy. There are other people you meet where it's the exact opposite. You meet them and you become friends with them for life. But I think where these two people were, and considering there are 7 billion people on the planet, I'd argue that there are other people where this would happen. And not everybody's on social media. Say, oh, let's trade social media. Well, I'm not on Instagram.
Well, let's just replace that with, exchange whatever online presences they have so that they could keep up with each other.
Email was a thing in 2003.
Yeah, that's true.
Email was a
But
thing. Cell phones were a thing.
true, but I do think that this is different in that you don't have to interact with the person. You don't have to send a message. You just follow the feed, and it feels to our bodies like we, for some reason, that we are with that person. We've caught up with them. Almost like it's a substitute for in-person socialization. I wouldn't describe email as a substitute for in-person socialization.
No, it's not a substitute for in-person socialization, but neither is social media. You have a window into a person's life, but you have a window into their life in so much as to what they are going to reveal.
Interesting distinction. Do you think that we're losing that distinction? The
Through social
distinction,
media?
yes. Do you think that we're maybe losing some of like what Bob and Charlotte had versus just following someone, and that is good enough? That socialization, so to speak, even if it's not a substitute for in person, that is good enough? Are we shaving off all of the like rawest emotions of the in person, of the more dominant in person socializations by engaging in more of those social media interactions? Do you think?
No, I don't think so, because social media is no replacement for a genuine in-person connection. It's no replacement for a genuine in-person communication. And I think more people, I know I myself am one of them, where I'm not going to really share life moments on my social media. Maybe if by popular demand enough people say, oh man, I want to know what you're doing with your life. And I'm like, cool, I'm just going to post the same thing I eat for breakfast every morning on a very private account.
So it's just a lot. It's very superficial compared to.
I wouldn't say that it's necessarily superficial, because there are a lot of genuine postings.
Right. It can be quite meaningful.
Yes. And there are a number of people I have met through social media, and there are meaningful relationships that I have continued to develop. And there are people I am friends with now who I met when I followed them on social media after a show or after a job. And it is a good way to keep in touch with people. But these are people that you choose to keep in touch with. Something like Bob and Charlotte is such a unique kind of relationship. And sometimes when you meet people, it's not meant to last forever. And that's part of the human experience. Sometimes
maybe had they gone on to a relationship, it would have only lasted a couple months before they ran into some horrible problems.
And this idea that we all have to be involved with each other's lives all day, every day, that's just not feasible. And I forget what the number is, and it's been discussed more and more about how sometimes relationships are becoming more shallow because of social media and how many people you know and how many people you're connected with, and that the human mind can only comprehend a certain number of deep personal relationships. And I don't think it's a large number. I thought I heard something like 14, but I don't know what the number is. I know it is likely less than 30. And social media exacerbates that. I follow almost 2,000 accounts on social media. Some are people, some are brands, but nonetheless, it's like, I couldn't tell you every single person that I follow on social media, because it's just people you follow over time. But sometimes a deep genuine connection that you make with a person isn't meant to last forever.
Mm-hmm.
Because the kind of forever that you experience with that person is within you. And sometimes forever is just a moment. Sometimes it's just a week in a place where you don't speak the same language as anybody else there.
Yeah.
And you're struggling to figure out who you are, and you meet somebody else who's struggling to figure out who they are at a different point in their life. So no,
Right.
to bring it all back, I would disagree. I think that these relationships can still happen, and I think they do still happen.
Yeah. Oh, of course the relationship can still happen. I
Yeah.
specifically wanted to know, like, when they part ways after that relationship happens, would the emotion be the same, knowing that you could follow, I'm not necessarily even interact with, but follow this person on social media so that you could see the updates and follow their life and see what's happening in their life from a, third person perspective.
Well, and again, I would argue that with where technology was at in 2003, it would be a lot more one-sided,
Hmm.
which would be different, but nonetheless, Charlotte would still be able to follow in some capacity Bob Harris
Yeah.
because he's a famous actor. He's going
Yeah.
to be photographed at events. He's going to be interviewed for press junkets. He's going to do commercials. He's going to be in a movie.
Right. And this
She
is, of course,
goes,
the age of the internet.
yeah, she goes to a movie. She could see him on a screen. She rents she rents a DVD and she could see him.
Yeah.
She types Bob Harris in a Gateway 2000, on Windows 98 or XP or whatever was the operating system at the time.
Right.
The dinosaur of what that is from that period.
So would
She
you?
could she could
Yeah.
find a blog that somebody's running as a Bob Harris fan account.
Right. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Would you say that humanity will always find a way for these connections to happen? Minus when we merge with AI, of course, and we're not even humans anymore. But
Someone will melt down the whole system before we get that far.
one can only hope. But yeah, there's just,
Someone
I don't
will
know, because the reason I was talking about this and thought about this question was that I just, watching this, I was overcome with this feeling that there is something about this movie that's time capsule-y and is capturing a moment in time that is sort of lost now, where you have, an in-person connection with someone, and it's just so much more sacred than it is now because of just, the rampant use of technology and how easy it is to actually follow people, and not just on a screen or what they're doing in their sort of, in their professional life or kind of what everyone else sees, but in like a very, what feels like personal way, I don't know. I felt like there was something there that maybe it's just the nostalgia of me seeing it when I was much younger, but I also just feel like there's something that we might have lost. And it's that this is capturing that.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with you to some extent, and I'm still gonna disagree.
Sure.
I totally agree with you. This is a time capsule, and I don't think any era has become a more rapid time capsule than the early 2000s, because technology advanced so rapidly during that period. We went from flip phones and fax machines in 2003 to the iPhone in 2007. And while the iPhone was 100% a status symbol in 2007, and still something that people were like, I don't know what the use for this is. My iPod works fine, and my BlackBerry sends my emails.
Right.
Because you couldn't get on Wi-Fi with your devices, I think, until a year later with the iPod Touch. Nonetheless, yes, technology has made some of these interactions a bit more challenging because we are all on our phones and we are posting to social media more often. And we are definitely engrossed in our technology. And I am one of those people. There are things that I think about in the context of this film when I'm watching it, where I think, wow, how different would this experience be if I had a phone connected to the internet 24/7? Because as I watched the film and I saw Bob taking these phone calls, my first thought was, boy, howdy, I sure hope he had a roaming plan turned on for those phone calls.
Yeah. Yeah.
When I went to Japan with a friend of mine, we had smartphones. We put a significant portion of our trip on social media.
Mm-hmm.
And when he and I went to Japan together, we were friends. Like, we would hang out. We'd worked on multiple films together.
Yeah.
We had developed a friendship. But we went from being friends on that trip to somebody I consider one of my closest friends.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to say that he feels the same way.
Yeah.
And I will never remember this night where we were at our ryokan together, a traditional Japanese inn.
You'll never forget the night. Right?
I will never forget that night because we were recounting our trip. We're probably about day 8, maybe day 9 of our 14-day excursion. And we are just thinking about the people we encountered,
Mm-hmm.
both the amazing, incredible people and the utter human cartoons from Florida that we had encountered that were about the most stereotypical weebs you could have met when
Mm-hmm.
we were at like an anime figurine section in Akihabara because we wanted to like geek out.
Mm-hmm.
And we went from introspection to just laughing until we were in tears on the steps of our inn drinking tea after we had done an evening bath at our inn.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember sitting on those steps as we are just wiping tears from our eyes, thinking, this is a person who will be important to me for the rest of my life. He and I are more than just run-of-the-mill friends who work on projects together.
Right.
Like, I knew in that moment he and I had a very special bond. And it's different than Bob and Charlotte's bond. But nonetheless, I still felt a very special bond develop with a person who was important in my life. And we had smartphones.
Yeah.
We put our whole trip on there. But the thing that mattered most on that trip and with that experience was when it mattered most, we put them away.
Yeah, because what really mattered was the entire experience of just absorbing everything together, And yeah, that's not a romantic experience, but the point is that you had that experience together. And like you said, it's something that changed your life. You never saw this person the same way again, in a good way. And that, my friends, I think is what we get to witness. We have the privilege of witnessing the version of that for these characters in a very true-to-life way, in a very realistic way. The pace of it, the strangeness of it, the unexpectedness of it, kind of like what Jon just outlined. And it's these experiences that sometimes are the most meaningful for us, and no one would ever have predicted that. And that's just exciting. That's irony. That's a reason to get up in the morning. And Sofia Coppola has constructed a movie in which we can quietly sit back and watch that experience, just like Jon's, that changed these two characters' lives. And we can reflect on our own. And that is more meaningful than most other movies with a lot of fireworks and smoking mirrors can ever hope to achieve. And that's pretty incredible. My listener question for this episode is, at what moment or period in your own life have you been in the same emotional space as Bob or Charlotte at the end of this movie? Or even during the movie? How does that experience allow you to connect with this movie in a stronger way? Jon kind of gave us his. I have mine. I'm sure you have your own. And I really hope that you do continue to have those experiences and to be open to them. Because they're out there. You never know where you're going to find them. But I really do think that we need to be open to having them. even if it leads to quote unquote nothing, which is what a lot of people say about this movie. I would disagree. I think it leads to something. It's hard to define. It's hard to put exact precision on, but it's something. And I'll tell you, it's a reason to be alive. Thank you to Sofia Coppola for making this really interesting movie that has resonated so much with so many people. Still to this day. Again, thank you to all the listeners for sticking with us and listening to season 2. I'm so excited for all the films that we have lined up, and we're just going to talk about so much interesting stuff, and I can't wait for you to be there with us while we do it. And last, but definitely not least, I would love to thank the great Jon Bewley for joining us in this conversation. Jon, thank you for returning. I hope to have you again really soon.
Yeah, thanks, man. I'm looking forward to it. It was great to be on, and I can't wait to talk about all the variety of films we agree on and one that we definitely disagree on.
Oh, there are several that we disagree on. It's going to be a fun time. And then also, just before I forget to add this in, we have chosen Lost in Translation today because I have added Max, as in formerly HBO Max, to the list of subscription services that we are pulling our movies from. So I would highly recommend it. It's an amazing subscription service. And they're not even paying me to say that. But Max, we're moving a little bit away from Netflix, so we might have some Netflix content, but mostly Max and Amazon Prime is where we're pulling from now. So thank you so much for listening to Speaking Cinema. I'm Andrew Schwartz, and I'll see you on the next episode.